Hello everyone, today we talk about the Burgundian Wars, or better, this is the second and last video introduction to Valois-Burgundian warfare, which is intended as always like some sort of very short overview, because we will naturally cover all of this in detail. You know, my channel is a brand now, consistency, because I will, that I am that insane to go in depth in all that stuff, battle after battle, historical military units, etc. Right? In the last several months, I sort of increased a little bit more these broader presentations. Many of you have just subscribed during this period, so you may think that I'm doing make a video about this, it's definitive, or it's just like an already niche and in-depth thing. No, it isn't. This is actually the military history of Valois-Burgundy as a whole. Today, for example, we will not talk about the Swiss Burgundian Wars per se, only we will talk about the Siege of Neuss, we will talk about the Battle of Guinegate, right? All again, to cover in depth, but something slightly different from the comparison between the Swiss and the Burgundians that we actually made a video on years ago, but was just sort of speaking about the broader, quote-unquote, civilian side of the story, not just the strictly military one. That is to say, why did these two systems go at war, and how could the outcome be so drastic? So to say, how could literally the Burgundian States annihilate itself against such an emerging and primitive power like the Swiss one, that however came up indeed with a quite unique military system that thus must be intensely observed, as we have done across the years, not quite seriously, but it's a topic, seriously by my standards, but it's a topic that recurs. Just recently made a video trying to explain there also what role that the Swiss Burgundian Wars had, aside from sort of the fact that the Burgundian army was the most powerful out there, together with the Venetian Condotte, and this generation was destroyed by this sturdy, rough mountaineers with something that, by the way, had never been quite seen during medieval times, namely an infantry that actually advances against cavalry, even manages in the broader battle maneuvers to cripple the entire battle lines order and so on. It's a huge deal per se, but there is also, in fact, a broader context that really requires to treat Burgundian warfare and politics, society to be treated per se, also beyond the wars with the Swiss, which we have done from probably the birth of the so-called Burgundian States, the Valois-Burgundy Burgundy history in the previous video, and that today, that after all, we covered almost everything. If it wasn't for these 3 years, 74 to 77, where most of the sort of most important military history of the Valois-Burgundy is concentrated, right? So we'll make our final considerations later. For now, let's simply give a look at this in summary, right? As if we're really telling a story, and let's see what's interesting along the way. Now, the Burgundian Wars, at least, were waged from 1474 to 1477, as we just said, and constituted really the truly decisive, at this point, in fact, ultimately fatal confrontation between the expansive ambitions of Duke Charles the Bold, ruler of the Valois-Burgundy territories from 1467 until his death, and the determined resistance of a coalition that included the Old Swiss Confederacy, the Eidgenossen, an alliance of largely independent rural and urban cantons that had been consolidating since the late 13th century. I also recently made a video about the Swiss Habsburg Wars that are sort of in the 14th century in particular, like another important chapter in Central European warfare of the era. You have also Archduke Sigismund of Austria's Habsburg territories in the Upper Rhine region intervening in these wars. These were lands inherited from the senior Austrian line, but chronically underfunded and militarily overstretched. The imperial cities of Alsace, the free cities of the Holy Roman Empire, such as Basel, Strasbourg, Colmar, Sélestat, and Mulhouse, which enjoyed direct imperial immediacy, which means that essentially they didn't have, as Freie Reichsstadt, any other prince ruling over them except the emperor, and jealously guarded their autonomy. You have the Duchy of Savoy that we didn't really discuss much during the course of Schwerpunkt, as an opportunistic ally of Burgundy turned victim. Basically, this was as you know, Transalpine Principality ruled by the House of Savoy that controlled key Alpine passes and oscillated between Burgundian and French alignment. René II of Lorraine, as a direct vital rival, probably the Duke of Lorraine from 1470, whose restoration ambitions directly clashed with Charles's protectorate over the same duchy. And most crucially, King Louis XI of France, that we made multiple videos on in this broader recompaction of France, of the Kingdom of France territorially after the 100 Years' War. He ruled between 1461 and 1483, known as the Universal Spider. There's a bit of a Black Legion sold on him, but he was actually one of the greatest French kings. I really like him personally. And if anything, the nickname is pertinent for his patient diplomatic web weaving, whose subsidies and diplomatic maneuvering ensured the coalition's cohesion and staying power. Now, there is all a herd of elephants in this room of Western Europe during the 70s of the 15th century. We just didn't list some of them, but also some more conceptual ones stand. First of all, quite rarely, an entire power of sort of tendential, at least regional ambitions, is literally wiped out in a single battle, especially in late medieval Europe, where most powers had de facto already well entrenched themselves. Some of sort of the medium ones, of course, could simply dissolve for dynastic reasons, with military defeats, etc. But the Burgundian states are often credited as being a sort of superpower. I personally have my enormous reserves about this. I think there are some cultural factors that they are a bit like the Byzantines of Western Europe, speaking of the pop hype towards them. They were incredibly powerful. As we said, they had the most advanced army of the year. They were incredibly rich, right? But in my opinion, having made tens of videos on Burgundian history, I would say that the political and institutional fundamentals of the system were fairly fragile, right? At least for the probably regional breadth, let's say, of ambition and power affirmation. Then you have even characterial issues. I mean, Charles the Bold is still an enigma to me, frankly. Naturally, it's not like I know history just because I make videos on them also, telling the truth, right? And at this rate, naturally, in a gigantic fashion, but I'm a PhD in medieval history, as a military historian in particular, so I know something about medieval Burgundy. I read my share of books on the subject, and it's unavoidable, and say, especially from a military lens, to observe that, again, it happens historically that certain big, powerful armies are annihilated by even sort of underdogs, opponents. However, it's a bit rare to see such repeatedly consequential defeat of such military system for the credit that it earned, right, in the battlefields of Europe in the previous generations, and simply not to see that there was something that didn't really work, right? The same can be said in a specular sense for the Swiss that emerged in this clamorous fashion, but that may have been slightly overrated to some degree, and probably the truth lays a bit in the middle, right? At some point in history, you will also find luck not being just the tip of the balance sometimes, but truly sometimes taking over an entire side. And in this case, probably literally the Burgundian states were literally self-annihilated by these campaigns against the Swiss. By the way, it had been the Burgundians that had gone to war with them. And basically with this military, with this manpower bloodbath, the system disarticulated. The Habsburgs stepped in because the French were about to mobilize. It's very interesting how Louis XI could have at some point invaded Burgundy, but always avoided, in a broader sense, until, in fact, the death of Charles the Bold, famously enough, at the Battle of Nancy. And so this majorly crippling phenomenon also for dynastic reasons, because at that point, as you know, his daughter Mary became the heiress of the system. She had been married. She would marry exactly in that moment with Maximilian of Habsburg. And so tying, especially what was left of the Burgundian States, because the French immediately occupied the Duchy of Burgundy. It was historically Kingdom of France and still remained as such, because this Valois-Burgundy were nothing but the Saint-Capetian house, right? And so also often the idea that I've seen this, I don't know whether it's a video game thing in pop culture, to conceive Burgundy as a sort of thing on its own, right? It's indeed a power that will try everything, especially under Charles the Bold, to self-aggrandize, trying to get all possible recognition. This is really typical, however, powers that are still fairly insecure of their role. The same Habsburgs refused a crown within the empire for the state of Burgundy. There is always this problem that it's a dominion straddling, in fact, the French kingdom and the whole Roman Empire. And generally speaking, it was an incredibly heterogeneous group of polities that were less heterogeneous in a broader cultural national sense. I mean, the Flemish communes, for the way they had also beaten repeatedly, uninterruptedly, from the early 14th to the late 15th century by the French knights, right? So remember always that Courtrai doesn't actually change much, if not in a broader moral sense, in a symbolical one for later historiographical reasons, but the French kept beating the Flemish uninterruptedly, as we will see now, until Guinegate, which was also kind of a draw, telling the truth, uninterruptedly from Montpellier. That was also a so-so victory of the Flemish just after Courtrai. In this, we made actually the previous video about Valois-Burgundy warfare to show exactly that. And then you have this hyper-ultra feudal, aristocratic, and French power. The Duchy of Burgundy is a powerhouse since the High Middle Ages as a province, de facto, of France that is deeply tied to the French crown, but also quite privileged, in fact, in the impediment of the former to annex the same duchy. It's quite early on, quite power-concentrated feudal state. And that's also the launch pad from which, in fact, the Valois-Burgundy had successfully conquered this essentially what would become the Netherlands and most of at least what were properly Flanders at the time, and lots of things along the way, telling the truth, that mostly fell so due to the mid-14th century crisis. Admittedly, they weren't faring that well. There weren't actually much of sort of regional powers on their own, but it's exactly that power fragmentation and vacuum, because the French were occupied with the English during 100 Years' War. The Holy Roman Emperor is not to be seen really much around, not even, in fact, in western part of the Kingdom of Germany at that point. And so Valois-Burgundy accumulated this vast power, but at the same time, the glue to keep it together seems to have been a bit scarce, right? This is not to say that the Burgundians could not win the Burgundian Wars. In fact, in my opinion, again, probably also hyper-overstated Swiss military quality. It was surely very high, and I'm not going to debate this, but it was also something that eventually would not hold ground for long in the broader art of war, nor would have this dramatic impact in a strictly sort of political, direct, territorial sense over most of the continent. It's mostly like their military model that probably was also being, it would have emerged somehow at some point, because pike and shot warfare was somehow ingrained in the fundamental political and social development of the era, together with technology, with a new way of seeing the world. But aside from, and this is also very relevant because some of these powers, by the way, would not particularly, the ones we mentioned, would take a while before converting their own, say, military system. The same French were quite conservative. They would prefer to hire the Swiss rather than create their own native pike squares. We've seen during the German peasant uprisings how the Duchy of Lorraine basically kept fighting with armies that pulled out of the bowels of the Middle Ages organically without much of a problem. The same in Germany was fairly rustic in its way of war for a long time, but in general, right, there is in fact a bigger picture that transcends the same Swiss. Now, Charles the Bold's character is also worth, okay, I'm going to make a biography video on him to explain this really better. In my opinion, he was a substantially capable ruler. I don't think he was that bad, but he also overreached, right? He had quite a temper. He probably is the expression, especially considering his final end, of a pressured monarch, right? That is seeking, as we were saying before, every kind of possible recognition, because he understands that the recompaction of the French crown is basically to wipe out at some point, sooner or later, the Burgundian state with all its incoherences. He's one of the great defeated of history, if anything, because he was slain in battle, and almost with this moralistic sense of medieval chronicles, looking at the great, almost pagan ruler that over-exceeded in display of wealth. But this is also very well documented. At the same time, that's also how we overly characterize it, because he actually failed. You can't separate the two things, because that's what actually happened, and I always say history is much more interesting than what-ifs. But, of course, historiographical interpretations maybe are dependent on this or that view. I personally experience I specialize in late medieval warfare, not this one, as you know, from late 13th, early 14th century, but I've seen how historiography in general, it's often quite debatable in the broader sort of assessment. Say the bigger the topic, the more difficult the assessment in general, because also the same experts normally don't venture much out of very specific, narrower fields of research. In any case, now Charles's strategic vision was rooted. We don't need to introduce here I made multiple videos about the Burgundian States if you're interested in the history and the sequence of rulers, etc. Here we start with Charles already in charge. You can check those out. And his strategic vision was rooted in the desire to overcome exactly that geographic fragmentation that had long characterized the Valois-Burgundian inheritance. Right, the northern Low Countries, Flanders with its international cloth trade centered on Bruges, the leading financial and commercial metropolis of Northern Europe until the silting of the Swin, at least. In fact, I made an entire video about Brugge, if you're interested, one of the few that I made outside Italy in terms of properly regional history for cities, because definitely the Low Countries deserve that in particular, next to basically the capitals, I don't know, Paris, London, and so on. As well as its emerging rival Antwerp, in the north, that would in fact become one of the great markets in early modern history, rapidly rising as a port and money market in particular. There was already a separation of what, say, in different areas, what will become, also for different reasons that were yet to be settled at that time, the United Provinces, in fact, will remain the Habsburgic Netherlands. What is fascinating, is that paradoxically, it's the Valois-Burgundy that, through the efforts of homogenization of local administration, these very different communal centers, and each with their own government, will confer by the end of the Middle Ages, and so paradoxically also by the end of the Valois-Burgundy rule and the passage under the Habsburgs that were not more liked by the Flemish, will confer an actual national, depending on what you want to see, this proto-national feeling in general for what will later become at least different nations in Benelux. But still, right, you have Brabant as well, that had historically been the most powerful, and in that sense actually feudal power mostly based in the interland in terms of centers of power. I made a video about the Duchy of Brabant, with the administrative financial weight of Brussels, a seat of ducal court and government, and Leuven, home to one of Europe's oldest universities. Hainaut, I made a video about this too, with its rich agricultural plains and fortified towns such as Mons and Valenciennes. These places, as you know, historic for different reasons, will become the battlefields of Europe, at least the most sort of besieged fortresses in Europe, relatively soon in time from these ones. Holland and Zeeland, with their seafaring economy, shipyards and fishing fleets, and Luxembourg as a sparsely settled but strategically located eastern mark, forming an economically vibrant bloc whose urban excises rival on the scale than Mons, salt monopolies and customs revenues supplied the fiscal sinews of the entire state. Right? Also made a video about Holland if you're interested. We lack Zealand, we lack Luxembourg. We have to make a bit more about the Dutch in particular. Now, these northern provinces acquired over the course of the 15th century through a combination of marriage contracts, notably Philip the Good's acquisitions from Jacqueline of Hainaut in the 20s, 30s of the 15th century. We've seen this in different videos. Feudal claims, outright purchases, such as the County of Namur in 1421, and military pressure, indeed, contrasted sharply with the southern patrimony. The Duchy of Burgundy proper focused on Dijon, the ceremonial and administrative capital with its ducal palace and the Sainte-Chapelle, a major center of Burgundian court culture, and its administrative apparatus in the free county of Franche-Comté, whose Jura uplands, salt works at Salins, vineyards, and mountain passes link the Saône-Rhône corridor to the Rhine basin. So, incredibly articulated territory. It's always good to point this out. In every video we talk about Burgundy. Also, if anything, here for a strategic dimension, how to control these territories. How had they even come together? And in particular, like how could they be maintained against pressure from essentially even more regionally sized powers just in the surroundings. Now, between these two zones lay the critical land bridge, in fact, of Lorraine and Upper Alsace. Lorraine, with Nancy as its capital and the Moselle and Meuse valleys as natural communication axes, offered control over north-south traffic, and a potential shield as well against French incursions from Champagne and Bar. Upper Alsace, a mosaic of Habsburg-pawned lordships, some of which were also the ancestral ones of the same house that had mostly, however, centered its power in southeast Germany by now, imperial free cities and ecclesiastical territories, including the Sundgau and the Breisgau, provided both economic resources, that is, agriculture, viticulture, river trade, and a forward position from which Charles could threaten Swiss autonomy and link his southern and northern holdings without reliance on French control routes. Charles regarded the acquisition and retention of these intervening territories as essential. Without them, the Burgundian state remained divided in two disconnected halves, vulnerable to blockade, interdiction, and piecemeal conquest. The military machine Charles deployed to realize this unification had been systematically rebuilt during the decade preceding the wars. Right, lots had been going on in European armies. There was ever more a tendency of maintaining a core of de facto permanent troops, some of which had been historically billeted in the main centers to garrison them from enemy raids, and an increased really amount of even una tantum professional mercenary so-called troops. The Burgundians had been pioneering artillery development thanks to the great material availability from Flanders that had good craftsmen in that field. They say artillery alone had not saved the Flemish armies from the same feudal ones of the Valois-Burgundy, but the latter would be able to put together a larger artillery park than the French royal one, right, initially. And also, in fact, the latter will essentially imitate the former when further developing, and sort of the massive firepower that Charles VIII brought with him to Italy against one of, in fact, of the single most fortified parts of Europe with success eventually, owes, in a sense, even to Burgundian development. Now, between 1468 and 1473, Charles issued a series of famously known ordinances that aimed to replace the episodic feudal levies of his predecessors with a more permanent, professional, and tactical integrated force. The Compagnie d'Ordonnance constituted the professional nucleus. Each company was authorized at 100 lances fournis. Each lance comprised one gendarme, equipped in the most up-to-date plate armor, often Milanese or South German in origin, a courtier carrying a sword and buckler for dismounted fighting, a mounted page responsible for spare horses, baggage, and rudimentary medical support, 3 mounted archers armed with long bows or short lances for harassment, flanking and pursuit, and attached foot elements consisting of 1 crossbowman, 1 pikeman trained to form the core of defensive blocks, and by the later ordinances, 1 or more handgunners carrying early matchlock or wheel-lock firearms. Right? None of this should actually impress you for the technological aspect, the technical, the armament. If anything, what is amazing here is how rich these companies really were, and how insisted also in the relative documents, the relative issues was the level of uniformity between the saints. It was essentially still a medieval army, right? The concept of the ordinance is something just like regularizing certain previous companies for how they had been developing in ever more consistent autonomous nuclei from the 13th, the 14th century. What matters here is having enough money to adequately supply them, to field them, to have this core body of troops that will be able essentially to partially live off of these salary and the same achievements of their arms, right? And all of this in a power that was considered at the time the top of European knighthood, chivalry, feudal, courtly culture, and ethos, right? And so here, that this was also a multinational army. There were basically everywhere from Europe. Soldiers were fighting in Charles the Bold's army. Even some specialties were at some point a borrowing. Think about the longbowmen, right, from the English, but also the adaptive French model. Think about the Scottish Guards during the 100 Years' War. There were lots of Germans, lots of Italians, lots of the same Englishmen, Frenchmen, from everywhere. Their look, aside from the impressive sort of aesthetical aspect, probably would really strike us, the colorful appearance of them, was, however, fundamentally still a medieval host, right, that relied on combined armor tactics, the centrality of cavalry, and increasing, again, firepower attached, and, if anything, magnificent for its enormous cost and capacity even to be kept together. Naturally, these military reforms are not, again, just the product of a whim. As we've explained, you can't feel the pressure of something hastily or at least quickly put together in a broader historical sense. What you realize about Burgundy is that these military reforms are, of course, within the sort of the character of the era. Also, the French will essentially issue similar ordinances, etc., but reflect on the costs and the aforementioned administrative heterogeneity of the system. The complete length, therefore, that we've seen, lance fournis, fielded approximately 9 combatants when fully mastered, combining mounted shock and mobility with foot resilience and firepower. Again, more or less how all armies out there work in Europe, but much better equipped, much more consistent. Companies were subdivided into 4 squadrons, the escadre of 25 lances, each squadron further segmented into 4 chambers of 6 lances to permit rapid tactical regrouping and command. Administrative support included master clerks to maintain payrolls and equipment inventories, trumpeters and fifers for battlefield signaling, provosts and sergeants to enforce discipline, and chaplains to sustain morale through regular masses and confessions. This was also practically normal for any medieval host of the time. separate infantry companies, nominally 1,000 strong, although actual strengths varied with campaign conditions, emphasize pike formations already, capable of withstanding mounted charges. This is perhaps an underestimated aspect of medieval warfare. Pike formations had always been around. The pike is truly the only way to stop cavalry charges, and the greater problem had historically been, if anything, just having enough of them properly drilled to to withstand cavalry charges, normally, however, being very still, not in movement. And this was also normal considering the fact that these armies normally had cavalry, overwhelming cavalry forces. And they mostly fought against similarly, practically identically composed opponents, right? So what will happen with the Swiss later, it's more like a gamble. It's not like a tactical style that per se will simply prevail, right? It's also a mono-arm system. So in line of principle, it's actually disadvantaged, right? They would invest more into it to make it something more formidable. But even in this sense, like this is not the first time that in the Middle Ages, for example, some infantries that had actually very high value did not have a chance to shine in their own armies simply because they weren't foolish enough to go out there just without cavalry themselves, and cavalry dominated largely. So we'll never... Again, the Swiss truly create something different and must increase, especially their infantry, their pikemen quality, training, discipline, etc., to cope with these other enemies. But this is exactly the point, that the odds were fairly balanced, that we're not looking at two systems that were inherently either superior or inferior to one another, all right? And what happens on the battlefields of the Burgundian Wars is also something relatively connected with command, with, again, the regular problems of warfare, like whether two battle lines would manage to cooperate, to link up with one another, whether the enemy has taken you by surprise or not, if you were outflanked with one side collapse. So something that had also relatively few to do with a military model just per se, right? The development of pikemen for increasingly better drilled and compact pike formations was already in the air. You could paradoxically see it even within the Burgundian army, except this is not really discussed overall because, first of all, it's difficult to simply measure it. You have to eyeball it by different sort of indicators you find here and there. And it's obvious that the Swiss at that point would champion the sort of probably pikeman quality because they fought only with those. And so they had to bridge the gap between the enemy and themselves in a way that had never been seen for a mono-arm, and especially probably an infantry force. Now, these infantry blocks in the same Burgundian army were supported by crossbowmen for medium-range fire, handgunners for close quarters disruption, and English, but also other nationalities, longbowmen, mostly, again, they would fight in that more famous at this point English style, recruited in large numbers for their capacity to deliver sustained high-volume volleys. And just to make an example, the Swiss did not have practically any missile element. They had few really missile troops, but not enough to be properly a combined armed thing. It was just like some skirmisher here and there pampering the enemy lines in preparation. They were fundamentally all heavy infantry. All right. When you think about this, for example, and you think about the 100 Years' War and how the English beat the French and at some point start dismounting to face better the same longbow, and also for other reasons telling the truth. And you think, well, the longbowmen did not even manage to stop, right, those foot knights that arrived in any case against their own heavy infantry in the center. And those were heavily armored troops. Why not destroying the Swiss with the longbows, etc.? Because this has nothing to do with, in theory, actually heavy infantry is never destroyed by missile. Any heavy is not defeated by light by definition, right? But in a combined armed capacity, they would have and they could have done that, right? So what happens during Burgundian wars, as it happened also in many other wars, is asymmetry that matters for, again, all other reasons: command, purpose, morale, luck as well. And so it's not much that the Burgundian army was weak or mal-assorted. On the contrary, right? It was, however, defeated still in these battles. It could not deploy its full potential. Ground, whereas we'll see now, also restrained. That was very good for the Swiss, for that matter. But we're not looking at intrinsically inferior military system per se, right? But chapeau to the Swiss for this striking series of marvelous victories. Uniforms as well. I have an entire playlist, an entire series dedicated to military clothing, for that matter, also for what we would conventionally call a pre-uniform era. But uniforms in a non-modernistic sense had always existed for some parts of at least some smaller units by scale, because obviously there wasn't much of a concentrated commander capacity or even investing for example, clothing in say dyeing military clothes, etc. Now, uniform visual markers were also the Saltire Cross of Burgundy. Soon on tunics, this through the Habsburgs will pass to the Spanish. Painted on shields or flown on company standards, promoted unit identification and cohesion. Training regulations were unusually detailed for the period. Pikemen drilled to kneel on command so that archers could fire over their heads without obstruction, but that is a bit too, perhaps, filmy. Again, battlefield mechanics work in a slightly different way, also because, in general, who does shoot, like the pike infantry formation, if you ever read this stuff, just know that it's not quite correct. The infantry formations were deep enough. Nobody would shoot in point blank range just for having the first guys, kneeling with their arrows passing over their heads, right? It was all about major volley zone fires of different sort of at hundreds of meters of distance at times, and sort of the capacity to shoot at closer range which was the most effective, happened mostly from the flanks, if you had been able to overrun the enemy once by way. Defensive squares or circles were practiced with pikes presented outward in every direction to repel cavalry from any angle. This had been, for example, carried out by some units like the Scottish Skilterns that, however, did not normally also enclose themselves in a porcupine formation. Now, archers learned to plant protective stakes in minutes to create temporary field fortifications. This is something that was experimented, especially, as you know, at battles like Agincourt. Some say that, they started appearing after the Battle of Nicopolis a few decades prior, because what the Ottomans felt like, in my opinion, yes, it's true that documentarily speaking that seems to be the case, but say protective stakes were already used and were becoming just generalized in a particular moment of military history, not much because they had never been used, or now they were actually the game changer at all. Handgunners received instruction in rapid reloading sequences under simulated combat pressure. So all these things, again, were being practiced across Europe. Discipline provisions were exceptionally rigorous. Desertion, looting without orders. I made an entire video about late medieval violence regulation, for that matter, which was a very serious thing, as you can imagine. Breaking formation in battle, failure to maintain equipment carried the death penalty, and captains were held personally liable for the readiness, conduct, and numerical strength of their men. Also, along this line, essentially a higher degree of intensity, but really in a formal sense, what existed all across Europe. The recruitment blended native, and these are just issues, right? It's not like armies would be just that. In fact, I also made one of my earliest videos about the ordinances for battle formations, because there were this sort of divertissement before battle, with all these schemes of how troops could be aligned that are incredibly complex, etc. But then we studied the actual battle accounts and realized that everything was, as a matter of fact, much simpler, much more conventional, right? So we are really looking at what was a very good but still fundamentally normal conventional medieval army. Recruitment blended native levies from all Burgundian provinces with foreign specialists. Italian condottieri companies supplied disciplined foot soldiers and siege engineers familiar with gunpowder artillery. English longbowmen, as we've seen, many of them veterans of the later stages of the Hundred Years' War, providing a reliable missile volume at long range. German handgunners introducing portable firearms in increasing numbers and broad experience in their tactical employment. Household troops drawn from the ducal retinue and noble clients, forming an elite guard and command cadre. All right, and there were lots of people, again, from all of Europe, many different noblemen, part of a higher nobiliary establishment that had bet on the Burgundian States and still dependent on them. Artillery trains expanded dramatically, as we were pointing out before. Lighter culverin offered field mobility for rapid repositioning during battle. Heavier bombards delivered siege power against fortified towns, and Charles maintained dedicated artillery personnel, cannoneers, masons for emplacements, carpenters for gun carriages and powder wagons, organized under master gunners who reported directly to the Duke. The overall tactical conception reflected Charles's intensive reading of classical military literature. This is also a bit of a blunder, like the idea that all of a sudden, people were reading the classics, which had already always been done throughout the Middle Ages, and if anything, most like Vegetius, Caesar, and so on. But all of a sudden this concept would be reapplied to the battlefields. No, I made an entire video explaining how still in the armies of Henry IV, Louis XIII, France, the greatest commanders of the era did not read anything about military treatises, right? They read stories, they read mostly, however, spiritual, religious stuff, things that had not much, even a properly military meaning per se. They didn't have any manual to tell them how to actually fight. There's a bit this mythology that should be understood, as of course these rulers were increasingly partly educated, literate, unlike in the previous centuries, and they, at least normally, and these works provided the model willing obedience, right? They were mostly sort of applied in a metaphorical sense, right? Ancient classical culture had always inspired. Think about the Roman d'Alexandre. This had been so famous historically, integrating also the more recent, there are also Celto-Germanic drafts of the previous oral tradition, etc. But in fact, these works mostly served to express a clear sense of hierarchy, right? To imagine how, for example, a fully regularly paid army with visible reward would substantially work. Because we made a video about the Landsknecht, and there were the response to the Swiss, for that matter. And you know that the problem there was chronic lack of pay, that brought to mutinies, to the same sack of Rome, etc. In Vegetius, that had been basically the fundamental military treatises that had always been read, and the Re Militari informed historically recruitment criteria, drill routines, equipment standards, and the importance of disciplined infantry is the foundation of victory, but merely in an indicative sense, in an ideal one, if you want. Medieval armies, commanders did not really need anyone to tell them how to fight, because warfare had historically been just something so constantly done, and also in the Middle Ages by the same scale of classical antiquity, that really, that we are the only foolish ones with our modernistic prejudices to think that they needed manuals to tell them what to do. The diplomatic prelude to open war centered on Upper Alsace. In 1469, Sigismund of Austria, burdened by debts incurred in his wars with the Swiss himself and lacking ready cash, pawned his Upper Alsatian lands to Charles under the Treaty of Saint-Omer for 50,000 florins. Charles appointed Peter von Hagenbach as bailiff, Hagenbach's administration was characterized by stringent taxation, confiscation of local privileges, judicial severity, and trade embargoes deliberately directed against Basel, Strasbourg, and Mulhouse to weaken their economic independence. Indeed, the Valois-Burgundy were pressing for a greater centralization, a heavier iron fist. So the Habsburgs did. The problem, again, was did you have the means to do so? Did you have the enforcers, especially? Now, when Sigismund concluded the Perpetual Accord, the Ewige Richtung, with the Swiss Confederacy at Constance in 1474 and sought to repurchase the pawned territories, Charles refused to negotiate. Right, Hagenbach was seized by Alsatian rebels in spring 1474, subjected to a summary trial by a makeshift tribunal of city representatives, and publicly beheaded. An execution then transformed diffuse local discontent into organized cross-regional resistance. The lower league coalesced rapidly, uniting the imperial free cities of Alsace, Sigismund's Habsburg interests, and the Swiss cantons in a formal anti-Burgundian alliance. Louis XI adhered to the coalition through the Treaty of Andernach in December 1474, committing substantial financial subsidies and promising to exert military and diplomatic pressure on Burgundian frontiers in Picardy and Burgundy proper. These, in fact, were the preferential, area of not just of military activity in the case of the invasion of the Burgundian States, but probably the most natural direction that the French would take to expand the northeast, reinforcing the control there, and eventually moving to Italy. But still, with the Burgundian States in between, in fact, was that was a deep balance here that stretches from Italy to England that brought the Burgundian States under the attention basically of everybody involved. Hostilities opened with coalition operations in Franche-Comté. In November 1474, Swiss and lower league contingents, reinforced by Habsburg cavalry, advanced in two parallel columns, one entering Alsace via Basel, the other via Porrentruy, and invested Héricourt, a fortified position commanding the principal road from Sundgau into Burgundy. The opposing Burgundian Savoyard relieving force under Henri de Neuchâtel and Jacques of Savoy numbered approximately 12,000 men, 8,000 mounted, 4,000 foot, which tells you, by the way, how important cavalry really still was in the picture. On November the 13th, upon receiving intelligence of approaching Burgundian reinforcements, the Allies raised the siege and attacked north of the town under the direction of Bernay's commander, Niklaus von Scharnachtal. Habsburg cavalry played a striking role in breaking the Burgundian mounted army in two successive engagements, inflicting heavy losses while suffering very few themselves. This is incredibly interesting because, again, you have the Habsburgs that were the rising star at this point in the East, really providing adequate nightly force as Germany was feudally, as normally providing historically, and beating Charles' men-at-arms. The shattered Burgundians withdrew through the Liseine Valley. A detachment from Bern and Lucerne maneuvered through wooded hills to strike at Chenebier, while the main body pursued to the heights of Freiherr. Final clashes completed the rout. Burgundian casualties exceeded 3,000 against negligible Allied losses. This was a disaster. The Héricourt garrison surrendered on November the 16th to Austrian occupation. Inhabitants were permitted to depart with movable goods, and the castle was transferred to Sigismund. The battle demonstrated the emerging battlefield effectiveness, among other things, of handheld firearms, particularly in the hands of Swiss skirmishers who used them to harass and disrupt the Burgundian cavalry formations because were heavy, would be called in. So again, the Swiss would not really develop anything more than this, but it's relevant because, again, the Swiss themselves, before the sort of more famous battles we will see now, could, of course, field a variety of troops. They did have them, right? They were also simple communes in a way, and so there was nothing specific about, especially this more freely available forces also hired from other places to being equipped in other ways, right? We're really a normal army out there, and their pike reforms that they had already been underway because of wars fought against the Milanese rather than with the Burgundians, were mostly thought for sort of bigger engagements, as we will see now. Most of this early clashes were war to war together, paradoxically with Habsburgic forces, something really, in fact, this is underrated and often forgotten a bit before the major clashes out there. And Charles, simultaneously, they were really spending a lot of money for war, committed to the Cologne diocesan feud in support of Archbishop Ruprecht against rebellious estates in the city of Cologne. This had historically negotiated power with its own archbishop that was one of the great, actually was the most powerful ecclesiastical prince in Germany. So it was one of the, elector prelates, right? And in Germany, lots of things happen on a regular basis. It's so fragmented. There isn't even any sort of specifically major, large war in the sense presented with any particular military reform or regional. It's all these continuous feuds between prince, bishops, leagues, etc. Charles famously invested Neuss from July the 29th, 1474, to secure his Rhine supply corridor toward Cologne. His army, estimated between 13,000 and 20,000 men, including Italian mercenaries, English longbowmen, and Burgundian household troops, established siege lines north and west of the city, relying on the Rhine and Erft to cover the southern and eastern approaches. Control of 2 Rhine islands was secured through repeated assaults in early and mid-August. This was normally the season again, and already things were starting to go colder. Although a pontoon bridge collapsed during one operation, drowning many Italian soldiers. The Burgundian encampment evolved into an elaborate temporary fortified settlement. Markets flourished. The Italian quarter particularly well provisioned with imported goods. Apothecaries received wagon loads of medicaments and spices. Clothiers, fishmongers, grocers, barbers, priests, musicians, hundreds of tents and wooden houses, windmills and water mills, forges, taverns, bathhouses, restaurants, a tennis court, and a gibbet. Diplomatic reception. This was a massive display of power. The Siege of Neuss was more of a big political international statement in Germany to show off power in front of the Habsburgs, rather than, any even sort of specific strategic issue, right? But this was also an enormous investment, and as you know, it wouldn't end particularly well. And so this was already an indicator of, Charles, you want to really overdo, right? Diplomatic receptions continued, this time without interruption, with foreign ambassadors entertained lavishly amid the routine of camp life, christenings, marriages, funerals. Defenders under Hermann of Hesse, reinforced by Hessian contingents and Kölners who smuggled provisions into the city while disguised as Italians, endured months of bombardment from over 200 guns that reduced gates to rubble and forced the garrison to subsist on rats, snails, and weeds. A September assault by 3,000 men, Italians and English archers, was repulsed with heavy loss. Right, interesting again, in this multinational Burgundian army combination of different peoples and their specialties. English archers at that point mutinied over arrears of pay, opening fire on Charles himself before he personally calmed them. Right, rumor of his death briefly even triggered slaughter of English troops until he appeared unharmed. Right, so not a very good situation. This is what doesn't normally happen in a cohesive army, right? A captured swimmer carrying a message from inside the city revealed Frederick III of Habsburg's impending relief army. This was the current Holy Roman Emperor, right? He's the guy who basically puts together all the branches of the Habsburgs, and securing the Holy Roman Imperial title for his house, de facto for good. Impending relief army. Charles intensified barrages without success, Frederick's imperial force of 20,000 men arrived only in late May 1475 after prolonged delays marked by drunken brawls among contingents from different imperial regions. As you see here also, you don't need people from other countries in general. The Germans are quite interested in their provincial differences. Minor skirmishes followed. A papal legate threatened both Charles and Frederick with excommunication unless fighting ceased. This is also the heavily underappreciated papal role in general, trying to actually put an end to clashes between Catholics. A provisional truce was signed on June 27, 1475. Charles dismantled siege works and withdrew the following day, having expended enormous treasure and strategic opportunity without decisive result. This was a massive, as we were saying before, sort of display of power. Right? He managed to alert and to mobilize the Holy Roman Emperor. This was serious enough because it was, the very heart of Germany, and he wanted to prove the Habsburgs that he was essentially enough of a king on his own account, and so he could have acted as one in the frontier area between France and Germany. But as we will see now also in this following years, things would not be recognized, right? And militarily speaking as well, there's massive display, as we've seen, of force, but with scarce results. In late 1475, operations shifted to Savoy, a Burgundian ally. In fact, Bernay's forces ravaged Vaud. In the Valais, the independent republics of the Siebensänden, led by Bishop Walter Super-Saxo, and reinforced by contingents from Bern, Saanen, Simmental, Freiburg, and Solothurn, defeated a Savoyard counterattack near Comté, west of Sion, at a battle on the Plante. This is also an underappreciated clash where on November the 13th, 1475, Savoyard forces were expelled from the lower Valais as far as Saint-Maurice. 17 castles fell into Allied hands, and Bern-Freiburg garrisons were installed in Comté and Saint-Maurice, effectively severing Savoy's land corridor to Italy, which for the Savoyards that had essentially at this point the greater center of their power in Piedmont was a big deal. And you see here that basically the Burgundians fail once again. Charles responded in February 1476 by marching through the Jura into Vaud. Grandson, recently seized by Bern, was recaptured. The town fell on February 21st. The castle surrendered on February 28 under promise of quarter. Charles ordered the execution of the 412-men Bernay's garrison, paraded past his tent, hanged from trees in groups of 10 or 20 per bow, branches bending under the weight, or drowned in Lake Neuchâtel over 4 hours, in a deliberate act of exemplary terror intended to intimidate the Confederates. This would not work. In fact, on the contrary, the atrocity unified Swiss opinion and steeled their resolve. The Confederate army, 18,000 to 20,000 men drawn from the 8 cantons and numerous allies, with Bern contributing the largest contingent of 7,343, advanced from Bevay. On March the 2nd, near consists the Burgundians, numbering 12,000 to 15,000 plus artillery, encamped north of the town with garrisons at Vaux-Marcus and further north blocking the Neuchâtel axis. The Swiss vanguard, approximately 2,500 men, including foraging parties and Schwyz handgunners, encountered the Burgundian vanguard while it pitched camp. Skirmishing ensued, with Burgundian archers initially advancing but withdrawing after losses. These skirmishes were also given time essentially to the formations to deploy. As the Swiss Gewalthut, the main battle, arrived, Confederate strength reached roughly 10,000. Charles deployed fully on the plain before Concise, intending to bombard the Swiss square with artillery before launching cavalry wedge charges. This is very interesting in general because these forces were well known to one another, right? Charles already knew how the Swiss fought by this point and had employed an important countermeasure. After all, at the same Marignano, the Swiss bloodbath was caused by by Venetian artillery. Now, the Swiss formed their characteristic square, halberdiers and ensigns in the center surrounded by ranks of pikemen, a small forlorn hope of 300 crossbowmen and handgunners forward, as we've seen here, really a small missile component. In fact, a handful of artillery pieces positioned on the left flank. The Swiss did not really have much of artillery to begin with. They mostly took it from the defeated enemies at this point. The Burgundians will in particular provide with all that force. This is a massive display also of wealth versus poverty, but still one that will favor the more primitive side. So imagine just a shot into the square, all right? Burgundian cavalry assaults, Charles' own guard in the second wave, by the way, drove back the skirmishers, but shattered against the pike wall. That was tested, as it was the norm, by the way, in medieval times. It's the consistency of the men, their discipline, their morale, the general sort of forces involved, like that will determine whether this pike square will collapse or not. A particularly fierce hand-to-hand melee developed on the Burgundian left under Louis de Chalon-Arlay, as his wing attempted to outflank the square's right corner. Right, and at that point would have been kind of done for, because what we talk about squares, but these were mostly like columns that didn't have much lateral protection to begin with. Now, Charles ordered a measured withdrawal of the center to draw the Swiss further onto the plain, exposing their flanks and rear to artillery and reserve cavalry. During this, you see, because there was more space, and so remember what we said before about combined arms tactics. At that point, you can basically put this mono-arm between hammer and anvil. During this delicate redeployment that arguably also just the Burgundians could carry out in this scenario, like in an effective way, speaking of their actual quality, the remaining Swiss Nachhut appeared on the sea. The Burgundian center misinterpreted the planned maneuver as defeat. This is a problem of communication and planning. Panicked and routed, carrying the rear guard with it. Charles attempted to rally his troops but was swept away in the flight. The Confederates, lacking sufficient cavalry for effective pursuit, this is a very big, important limitation for the Swiss, contented themselves, however, with looting the abandoned camp. Casualties remained comparatively light, Swiss approximately 200 dead and wounded, Burgundians around 1,000. Yet the loss proved catastrophic. In fact, the entire artillery park of roughly 420 pieces, predominantly small caliber guns, it was actually the norm still at the time, 300 barrels of powder, 10,000 pack horses, 1,500 wagons, and Charles's personal treasures, including the 55-carat Sancy diamond, carpets reputedly belonging to Alexander the Great, the three brothers' jewel, silver bath, and ducal seal fell into Swiss hands, right? That now had something to play with, so to say. Charles withdrew to Lausanne and immediately set about rebuilding, right? This guy was tough, like mentally speaking. Charles the Bold was very strong indeed. Metal was melted down for, you understand how repeated, by the way, this campaigns really were. He was always on horseback. Metal was melted down for cannon in Dijon. That was, as you know, the historical capital of the Duchy of Burgundy. It was not that far away. Lorraine artillery was confiscated. Allies provided funds and contingents from Italy, Germany, England, and Poland. By late May 1476, remember, many of these princes, the European princes, had their stakes in Burgundy's survival, right? Because especially they feared French expansionism. And by late May 1476, Charles had thus assembled perhaps 20,000 to 25,000 men in Lausanne, subjecting them to intensive training despite chronic supply delays, and overdue pay that forced cost-cutting measures such as dismounting horse archers. This is also not good, especially, again, he had definitely the means to recruit such large amount of troops that by the time standards were actually pretty big armies, right? The Swiss were consistently smaller on a regular basis. And here there is all, as we've seen, a logistical apparatus, but properly a military organization that only Charles here can successfully handle, right? But everything hastily carried out is also, yes, a proof of strength, of efficiency, but effectiveness and actual expendability of this all is something different. And every war presents this issue. Even when you do everything right, maybe the last thing you do wrong will make you lose everything. And actually here, Charles, had he survived these wars, would have been a great explainer of. On June the 9th, Charles advanced to Morat, Morton, 30 kilometers from Bern, intent on isolating the city. The Burgundians fortified their encampment behind a defensive palisade and ditch known as the Grünhag. On June 22nd, a Swiss Confederate army, estimated 24,000 or 25,000 infantry, this was among the largest they ever brought on the field, plus 1,800 cavalry from Lorraine, Alsace, and Swabia under René II of Lorraine, advanced in Echelon. The vanguard of 5,000, with René's cavalry on its left, was momentarily checked by heavy bow, handgun, and light artillery fire from the Grünhag, but the Schwyz contingent bypassed the earthworks and struck the Burgundian flank, while the main pike charge overran the defenses and surged toward the camp. Successive Burgundian units arriving to reinforce the Grünhag were swept away by momentum. That's the power of a properly drilled infantry column, right? It wasn't much about individual quality. Pike fencing was pretty sort of rough, to say the least. But it's the compactness, the collective cohesion, and the push, right? Also, the infantrymen one after the other, that really overwhelms everything, right? The Italian division under Troilo da Rossano engaged in siege operations was, for example, trapped and driven into Lake Morat, with few escaping. Northward retreat was blocked by a detached Swiss unit positioned northeast of the lake, a dock, right? This is also part of broader strategic capacity, terrain knowledge, and again, congratulations on the Swiss for this. Only the Savoyard division under Jacques de Romont, less involved in the main engagement, fought its way out, eastward, out of this death labyrinth. The slaughter claimed 8,000 to 12,000 Burgundian lives, approximately half of Rossano's Italian infantry, together with over 200 artillery pieces. Swiss losses ranged from 410, primarily Béarnais of the vanguard, to possibly 3,000 according to the Milanese envoy present in the Burgundian camp. Here, numbers aside, it can be debatable, whatever, you realize what's been happening, right? And also what kind of initiative the Burgundians had left to the Swiss to begin with to create this trap. The Morat disaster intensified the revolt in Lorraine, led by René II, by the way, which was trouble for the Burgundians. After René recaptured Nancy, Charles invested the city from October the 22nd, 1476, with 8,000 to 12,000 men under harsh winter conditions, hoping to reduce it swiftly before relief arrived. René assembled 10,000 to 12,000 Lorrainers and 8,000 to 10,000 Swiss mercenaries, reaching Nancy early on January the 5th, 1477. Informed of the approach, Charles drew up his reduced army in a defensive square south of the city on a heavily wooded slope behind a stream at the narrowest part of the valley. Infantry companies and dismounted gendarmes formed the large square with 30 field guns positioned forward at the crest. Mounted knights and couturiers guarded both flanks. Allied scouts recognized that a frontal assault would be disastrous. The vanguard of 7,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry was directed to engage from the right, while the principal thrust, 8,000 infantry and 1,300 cavalry, executed a difficult 2-hour circuitous march through thickly wooded, snow-covered slopes to emerge slightly to the Burgundian rear in wedge formation. A small rear guard of 800 handgunners acted as mobile reserve, but they were essentially full in, right? We'll see it better when we'll make the video about the single battle, per se, from primary sources, that this was a full in, right? You had to gamble the entire attack went well, because if you were sort of cut down out there in the open, there was no escape. There was no way back, right? This was a gamble catching the enemy off guard, right? And in fact, and this succeeded, but again, it was a massive, like, this shows really the moral force of the Swiss at the point. It was also something extremely risky, as the most rewarding things in warfare are. After the flanking force emerged, Swiss horns sounded 3 times and the downhill charge commenced. Burgundian artillery attempted to retreat, but elevation rendered most fire ineffective. The single volley discharge killed only 2 men. Burgundian right-wing cavalry briefly held off the Swiss left, but the infantry square was soon engaged in a one-sided struggle by overwhelming numbers. The vanguard threw back the Burgundian left wing and overran the artillery. Charles vainly transferred troops from his left to stand the center assault. The weight of Swiss pike formations proved decisive. The square disintegrated and retreat began. Charles attempted to rally his staff, but was carried along by the fleeing mass until surrounded. A halberdier delivered a fatal blow to his helmet. His death went unnoticed amid the chaos. The body was notoriously discovered 2 days later on the frozen river Meurthe, stripped by pillagers. This was typical after the battles, like especially with this sort of sumptuary panoplies, like the local peasants would sort of strip the corpses from everything. And identified by his Portuguese physician in Valette through a missing tooth, because wolves had started already to eat some pieces. Ingrown toenail and long fingernails, by the way. Pursuit continued for 3 days across 15 to 18 miles. Only the few who reached Metz, over 50 kilometers, survived. Charles' death extinguished the Valois-Burgundy male line and precipitated the War of the Burgundian Succession, 1477-1493. Louis XI moved swiftly to incorporate French suzerain fiefs, the Duchy of Burgundy proper with its capital at Dijon, the counties of Vermandois, Ponthieu, Boulogne, Artois, and portions of Flanders, as reverted domains, having sort of lawfully belonged, in fact, to the Kingdom of France. Mary, Charles's sole legitimate heir, issued the Great Privilege on February 11, 1477, restoring provincial autonomies and privileges to quell unrest in the Low Countries. On August 19, 1477, she married also Archduke Maximilian of Austria, transferring the Burgundian Netherlands and Franche-Comté to Habsburg control. Maximilian defended the inheritance through a combination of diplomacy, reminding Louis XI of the 1475 Peace of Soleuvre, and military action. At Guinegate, on August 7, 1479, Flemish Habsburg forces, employing pike-squares modeled on Swiss tactics under commanders such as the Saint-Jacques de Romans, we have seen before, and Engelbert of Nassau, that Maximilian had hired to properly train the local Flemish militias, partly in this new Swiss fully pike-square, almost fully pike-square fashion, repulsed French cavalry led by Philippe de Crèvecoeur, despite heavy losses on both sides, marking the first large-scale use of Swiss-style infantry formation by a non-Swiss power. Right? I recently made a video about the Landsknecht, as I was saying before, and so you understand how this legacy lived on, given that we're talking Maximilian as their father, right? So things were changing, models were being applied. As you see here, this force, the Flemish army will never be created. Essentially, like the Netherlanders did not really appreciate Habsburgic interference in their affairs. They accepted it as far as the French had become a threat. Yet the fact that, in fact, the invaders' cavalry was stopped, albeit with heavy losses also from the defender's side, was an important sort of step in the history of the art of war, at least in a broader moral fashion. Mary tragically died from a riding accident on March the 27th, 1482. Her infant son, Philip the Handsome, Philip the Fair, succeeded under Maximilian's regency. This would be Philip I of Spain and the father of Charles V. The Treaty of Arras, signed on December the 23rd, 1482, recognized the French annexation of the Duchy of Burgundy proper and several other territories, while treating Franche-Comté and Artois as dowry for the proposed marriage of Maximilian's daughter Margaret to the French Dauphin Charles, the future Charles VIII. Charles VIII renounced the engagement in 1491, marrying Anne of Brittany instead. Right. The resulting dispute was settled by the Treaty of Saint-Omer on May the 23rd, 1493, which returned Franche-Comté, Artois, Charolais, and certain minor lordships to Philip, while confirming French retention of the Duchy of Burgundy with its capital at Dijon. Right. Had it been for the defeat of and death of Charles the Bold in battle, in fact, the annihilation of the Burgundian army at the hand of the Swiss, Louis XI would have not invaded Burgundy. Right. He had sort of refrained from doing that for quite a long time. He probably sort of aimed at creating some matrimonial strategy. At some point, Mary could be having a French marriage, right? But it's a bit what will happen with Britain later, that the French will acquire, after a very long time of de facto independence, if at least it was autonomous from the French most of the time. True, in fact, a royal marriage, and also because of different reasons. In the case of Britain, if anything, we shall make new videos on to explain a bit better. So the wars demonstrated, first of all, that the effectiveness of the Swiss Gewalthafen pike-square tactic, dense blocks of pikemen supported by halberdiers, handgunners, and crossbowmen, but mostly again being about sort of these columns being able to push ahead regardless of any other possible danger, including being outflanked and caught between two fires. Again, they had been extremely lucky, and no great army wins without fortune. This is very important. Theologically, we know that you have to chase fortune in order to win. You also have to take some beating anyway before fully getting her. All this against traditional heavy cavalry dominance, which hadn't been the first time in the Middle Ages, but stemmed, in fact, from now a different tactical formula, right? Actually, cavalry will remain dominant for a while, at least in the following decades. Yes, infantry will completely take over, but it would be the same royalty that invested in this kind of military system. We've seen that, so the greater powers of Europe, the ones led not by communes, but by kings, were the only states that could afford, in fact, to arm these subjects in a way that had very few to do with the early 14th century infantry victories that were mostly something extemporary, mostly taking advantage of the crisis of great medieval civilization in some frontier areas. All right. While other powers, also very feudal, very princely in nature, we've seen it in the video about the war of the League of Schmalkald, continued to fight also with very archaic means. All right. And so, yes, pike and shot warfare was to fully kick in, but it was rationally accepted rather than simply emerging out of nowhere, as opposed to some sort of defeat of the nobility in general. The nobility at this point was actually affirming itself further as the Ancien Regime and maintaining their primacy for other 300 years. Victories at Granson, Morat, and Nancy shifted the balance towards disciplined infantry formations anyway, accelerated the rise of Swiss mercenary service across Europe, and marked the decline of chivalric cavalry as the decisive arm that also the Valois-Burgundy had championed historically as models of knighthood and courtesy. Also, the Burgundian States ceased to exist as an independent power. Its northern provinces as we've seen, passed to the Habsburgs, laying foundations for the later Spanish and Austrian Netherlands, while the southern heartland was absorbed into the French kingdom, fundamentally altering the international configuration of Western Europe, in particular between France and the Empire. Truly a new chapter would open with the Wars of Italy some years later. And these are all steps that we are following quite carefully, one after the other, because in order to create this sort of broader tapestry, right, weaved through sort of battle after battle, campaign after campaign. I stopped counting now how many videos we made about the Burgundian army, especially the Swiss, that over the last couple of years raised in quantity, but still paradoxically we haven't covered in inadequate number. And especially passing through these battles, right? At this point, we have to pass through the lottery for having perhaps something more in depth, because here I'm covering still those big topics that we have never fully looked at, like this one, for example. Really never made a video about, again, not properly the Burgundian Swiss wars, but still, like, here military history essentially of Charles the Bold, and there was something before in his youth in the previous episode, but just for the case, like, this is I will not count this as a Swiss warfare video, because it's just focused on the Burgundians. Again, we will have better, I say it for the sake of the playlist if you want to find them, right? But in fact, if we look at the Burgundians, medieval Burgundy, okay, here I put together also the Kingdom of Burgundy, the Burgundians in the migration era. The Burgundian warfare mostly, contains only, well, no, there is one about the Kingdom of Burgundy, but all the others now contains basically about the Valois-Burgundy 6 videos. And also, by the way, I made, 9, this is the 10th video about properly the states of Burgundy. States of the Duke of Burgundy, and I think I made, no, not yet. I will create another playlist also about the Valois-Burgundy, but I already created one about the Valois, that includes them. So again, it may sound complicated. Perhaps I should make just the Valois the single ruling house there. I would better, But in any case, we will continue through this path. I hope that you enjoy the general focus on these campaigns, because in a broader strategic sense, it was the only, and with some biographical genre, the only kind of video type that we missed on Schwerpunkt. I sometimes realize that it's all a bit too condensed. It's not in my style, like to dissect things, as you know, in much greater depth on a regular basis. But I think that if I don't make these videos, people are not going to watch much of the rest either. Here I see, for example, that the video about the Egyptian New Kingdom's army's size is, receiving very scarce amount of views. People mostly subscribe because they want to look ethnic, brutal, and in their view nationalistic European stuff. But if you don't really understand the influence of the art of war and of these peoples on your own history, it's useless, right? You should study the thing if you are into the sea peoples and you like the Urnfield culture. So you can't abandon sort of the Bronze Age Egyptian warfare, because there was so much of that. Like, the sea peoples are right to fight there too. And so I know, unfortunately, the main reasons behind everything, it's sort of weird because these are the blind followers, right? Not of mine, I mean of ideology, right? I'm way more far right-wing than them, but they truly don't understand that somebody criticizes their taste. It's not because, it's against that direction, but it's meant exactly to reinforce that direction. You can't control the world if you don't know the world. It's dumb to begin with. For today, however, we covered an important part of 15th century warfare. And so you have these ups and downs also in the type of content provided. I really enjoyed, however, making these videos because they feel necessary. They feel like, oh, okay, finally I covered that. I can't say that. Especially for a militaria channel, you have the basic military history of such players, and it's all incredibly, again, useful for anyone that just searches, for example, for a compendium of this military history, Charles the Bold and so on. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.